Hi guys, it's Khalil.
Hey, it's Chad.
We are the Marshals of Truth. So, to begin our third episode on the Truth series we began a few days ago, we want to do a quick recap on what we were talking about at the end of our second episode. Um, and we just want to say like the main focus of that last part of the discussion last time, the second episode, was about extreme examples of kernels of truth in every argument. So, like, we wanted to make the point that there is no exception, at least from what we could find, that an argument, however deranged or evil, like doesn't have some kernel of truth in it. We wanted to make the point that no matter how extreme a political movement or how evil we think someone or some group of people are, there is something about what they're thinking and how they came to that conclusion that is somewhat based on truth, however minimal or extreme, you know? So there's that. But then we also want to stress the point that by complicating our world and the understanding that every side has a piece of truth in it, that we don't let that recognition of both sides lead us to inaction. You know, we don't want to be held back because we believe that every side has a piece of truth. So, Chad, to begin, you have anything to say on that so we can get started?
Yeah. Um, to go back to the thing about how every argument has a piece of truth, as we said, it goes to even the most extreme examples. Some of them are, conspiracy theories. One of which that I like to think about a lot is the conspiracy theory that the moon landing was fake. And even though it's been more than 50 years since the July of 1969 mission of Apollo 11, there are still people today who doubt that the mission even happened and doubt that NASA and other organizations have accomplished this. Even in this whole argument, it seems very baseless, and over the years it's been discounted many times. But even at the very basic levels, there are some tiny bits of some truth to the argument on why some people believe this conspiracy theory. One of the lines of thinking that just leads to doubt about the mission or just other things in general is an allegation that NASA lost the footage for Apollo 11, and that's kind of an allegation meaning that like it was all faked and that they're hiding the real footage from us and this, that, and the other. There is a level of truth to that because during the Apollo 11 mission, the recordings were on different tapes and it was recorded live. Everything was streamed live to the televisions and the cables at the time. But in around 1980s and around the 80s or so, some of these tapes of the original footage was lost in some sort of like sorting accident. Um, and so there's a level that, yeah, some of the footage was lost, and while those tapes themselves were lost, everything on them had already been transferred and even then had been streamed live back in 1969 to the cables to the televisions. And so we still do have the exact footage of what happened on the moon, have the audio, all that kind of stuff. Yes, it's grainy. Yes, that's the quality that we had at the time. But just because the recordings were lost doesn't mean that the footage was faked or just unbelievable. And so when you look at the argument on why people were doubting, the recordings that they given out, maybe it was recorded in the studio, this, that, and the other, the whole argument of some of the footage being lost is a little bit true, but it's not enough to continue along that line of thinking on everything being faked, everything being like that. And so that's another example of how even some of the most extreme or pretty baseless conspiracy theories or arguments do have a tiny bit of truth to them. And if they didn't, there wouldn't have been, anyone to support them or to keep following them 50 or so years afterwards.
Yeah. And then there is a another wait a minute, 1 second. Yeah, sorry about that. Another reminder that we're kids is that my dad was just like putting up a Find My iPhone alert on me. Okay, anyway, a second point that we wanted to make about the about kernels of truth in every argument is the Soviet Union. Now, of course, we live in the West, um, and we're going to have a certain bias, but there is a strong argument that Stalin was not a good guy. so, so I
I can
mean,
see evidence for that too.
yeah, exactly. I mean, like, like we're starting with the idea that Stalin was not a great guy. So finding out evidence for the other side is just going to be a tiny little drop in the bucket before we immediately make the conclusion that he was bad to begin with all again. But the Bolshevik Revolution back in 1917, um, um, it seemed to be a very good moment in the minds of the Russian people and the people that were under Russian control. That there was going to be this good new time that was going to usher in a new era that was going to be pretty much all good. And like under the first few years of Soviet rule, there was already a good idea that it would not be as great as people were imagining that it could be. There were red scares throughout the country. There were anti-Bolshevik movements that rose up in the country that started up a civil war that lasted for about 4 to 5 years and where millions of Russians died all over the country. Um, like Western like lack of support, aiding rebels against the Bolshevik regime. Like the quality of life in the Soviet Union was already not looking too great. Now the rise of Stalin in the mid to late 1920s, um, well, it started a lot with agricultural reform, from what I remember, is that there were these high class of peasants in the fields, because so much of Russia at that time and so much of the people were part of an agricultural background. This high class of peasants being called the kulaks, they had a bit more land than the average peasant. They had a bit more wealth and more food. They almost rarely went hungry, in comparison to their other peasants. And Stalin, his rise to power, however evil he was proven to be later on, was by eliminating this class and providing more land, for the rest of the other peasants in the fields through a process of collectivization, that people would always have a bit of food. There wouldn't be private property. There wouldn't be people like the kulaks that could take more food for themselves and then not give it to people that might need it. Um, so the process of collectivization, which led to incredibly terrible things like the Holodomor in Ukraine, for the most part, which killed 5 to 6 million people. That was a direct result of his agricultural policies, which was which was supposed to solve the problem of private property in the kulaks. So there's the idea that Stalin might not have been as bad as we think, because he was just trying to solve a lot of the like enduring problems of the Tsarist regime. But then, of course, what you could see immediately after that were famines like the Holodomor, which almost deliberately killed 5 to 6 million Ukrainians, which is leaving out the great purges, some deliberate killings throughout the like World War II and after, putting people in the in what were they called? I'm blanking on the name. The prisons in the Siberia.
The gulags.
Gulags, right. So, yeah, I mean, we come back over to the conclusion that Stalin was not a good guy. And the third example, because we just had to have a third example, was with, just give me 1 second. but Chad, why don't you go on about the Putin and Western hypocrisy example? I'll be back in a minute.
Sure. So our whole point that we're trying to make with these ones is that even some of the most extreme arguments that we see carry out, um, they do have some kernels of truth with them. And another one of the big examples that we have now is Russia's war with Ukraine. As we saw in the beginnings of Putin's kind of reveling up the world and his nation for getting ready for this kind of conflict, Putin was pointing out a lot of aspects on why Ukraine should be invaded, why the West was kind of the enemy, this kind of that thing. One of the points that he put out was that um, NATO, which the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, had been in place since the Cold War, and after the Cold War ended, a lot of people casted doubt on why NATO existed. Russia itself had its concerns with why NATO still existed afterwards, with it being a defense organization, but there wasn't really much to defend with. If the West, from Putin's perspective, was wanting to have a safe and stable Europe and to have one that doesn't really have these kind of power conflicts, there wasn't really a purpose to have NATO still be existing. And going forward, Putin would kind of draw that doubt on why NATO needed to exist and why they had to be there. Going forward, this kind of brought back to why NATO was still wanting to expand, in Putin's view, into more of some of the Eastern European countries like Poland, Latvia, Romania, ones like those. When, in his view, if the West wanted to have a safe and secure Europe without these kind of competitions, NATO didn't need to be expanding outward into what it felt was kind of areas that could be used for offense. Um, and if the West did want to kind of have that kind of security there, they didn't really need to do so, in Putin's point of view. And so he used that aspect of NATO gaining new countries and moving closer to the country as a reason that NATO should be opposed, that their influences should be opposed, that they should not be supported, that Ukraine should be kept out of them, because Putin saw Ukraine as another example of the West and NATO kind of expanding more than they needed to be and going against the West wishes of having, a secure Europe. And I'm sure Leo can kind of continue this one.
Yeah, I've actually been writing a paper on this that who knows might even become a book. And like, I wasn't here for the first 2 minutes of your description, but I can imagine you're probably talking about like Russia's like um, security paranoia about NATO expansion towards the east.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, his worries about the West and hypocrisy um, began probably as early as the 80s, back when he was a KGB agent. Now he wasn't the sort of like James Bond sort of spy we imagine it to be like from the KGB, but he was an intelligence officer. It was his job back in the 70s and 80s when he was part of that role to do counterintelligence, to put false narratives into the Eastern Bloc and in within Russia itself to make the people think that the Soviet Union isn't that bad, to extend influence abroad, all around the world that may be like leaning towards a socialist or communist state, that would make them more likely to turn. That was his job, to create false narratives. It was his job. He was taught to lie. So he kind of bought into that like propaganda back when he was really young. And so when he heard about the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was a really big, brutal, like pain to him, you know. And he didn't just look at the fall of the Berlin Wall itself because, he in his mind is thinking, I could be confused into thinking that this is the will of the people, with all the protests and stuff. He's probably going to think, based off of the the earlier speeches by Reagan and Bush at that time, um, that it was actually a Western conspiracy to put Russia down. And that's why the fall of the Soviet Union very soon after in 91 was a very personal moment for him that really led him to never trust anything that came out of a Western leader's mouth after that. So when there was a period of possible negotiation from like, I don't know, September, October of last year to February of this year, um, like every time the West said, okay, fine, what about Ukraine neutrality? You know, Putin immediately assumed that they were just going to do a backhanded deal and put them into NATO anyway, or put troops in to dissuade a Russian attack. And that's why he did it, because he didn't trust the West. So, of course, there is that point, but international law from the UN and the UN Charter, which Putin, cites all the time, is that not one nation can enhance the security of theirs over another. And just to round out this last example, you know, he says that Ukraine's like security through NATO would actually it would disrupt the balance of security and make it so that Russia's security was ever more in threat.
Mm-hmm.
No, but in reality, by doing what he was suggesting, moving back all of the NATO countries' expansions back to the year of 1997, to the central of Europe, taking away Poland, the Baltic states, and some certain states in the Balkans, then that would have endangered the security of those nations for the benefit of Russia. And that was the thing that Putin is missing, or he's willingly ignoring it. That's why he's not on the side of truth, because he's ignoring these crucial facts. So he's going to pay for it.
Yep. As we said, that kind of belief that the West was coming to go for Russia's downfall, that belief that everything was a conspiracy, all of that came back to the paranoia that the West would keep encroaching upon Russia when they fell, and to a certain extent, it did happen. As we said, we had NATO expand after the 1990s, which, to his point of view, contradicted what they were saying, or contradicted their beliefs of wanting a secure Europe. And so that when the obviously occurring things of the expansion of NATO, which I may add is an elective decision by the countries to join NATO. It's not NATO recruiting them or forcefully invading them and bringing them under their umbrella. It's a country's choice to join NATO. Anyways, because
Absolutely.
those truths happened, that's why he had that point of view, but it's one that's obviously slanted from the full truth.
Right. Like there was a speech that he made, and I could go on and on about this, and I have in my paper. But there was a speech that he made in Munich in 2007 at the at the conference of security policy, something like that. Um, and he said, almost quoting directly, like like the chief superpower of the world of today, like post 1991, post 1989, the United States, it tries to rule the world through the guise of democracy, and no one wants this. That's what he said. It's like the US is trying to take over the world with this ideal of democracy, and no one wants it. Um, but I bet he's going to say, and he's already saying, through the Russian state TV propaganda network, that the bringing of Finland and Sweden into NATO is a direct threat to Russia's security and a offensive action by NATO and therefore the U.S. because he believes that the U.S. leads NATO. Um,
Which is
um,
kind of true, to be honest.
it is kind of true because we have the highest military spending, and all that we have more stuff, but what we say doesn't dictate everything. That's why when Erdogan was saying, I will not let Finland and Sweden into the alliance, there was actually like a need to negotiate with him. That's why yesterday, when the deal was made with Erdogan, like of finally letting them in, that they had to make serious concessions. They had to extradite all PKK, like Kurdish militants, and even civilians back over to Turkey to be tried. They had to get rid of some of the sanctions that were on Turkey, some of the blockades, or like some sort of like economic like limit that was on Turkey. Like there were concessions that had to be made. And if the US or other Western nations like the UK that Putin is so worried about actually lead the alliance, then there wouldn't be any need for any sort of discussion with Turkey. It would just happen. But because every nation has a veto and every nation like coming into the country gets support from the people, from the elected officials, and the head of state, the idea that Putin says like the US president alone decides NATO and runs it and lets people in and lets countries in, like it's not true. So he's not on the side of truth. So we
Yeah.
covered that up. All right. That took a little while than we needed to, but if there is some Russian bot on here or somebody that's like being swallowed up by Putin propaganda, then there's that. I could go on, but we're not.
We
So
definitely could. All right. So going forward from that, as we said, there are levels of truth in every sort of argument. Some will have more, some will have little. Um, and so when you look at kind of arguments, it's easy to kind of just sit there and say, that side, they do have some merit. And then that side over there, they do have some merit from there. And it's easy to be like, just leave it at that. And so there's a problem with that. What you're doing is basically staying neutral in the middle of those arguments. You're not siding with any because you acknowledge that they have some truth to them, in which they do, but you're not really doing anything like that. And when that comes onto the world stage, when that comes into politics, just regular decision making, that's one that could be very, very troublesome because your actions have consequences, but also your inaction can have consequences as well. In general, you could take an example of just the idea of war. You know, war. It's a truth that war is detrimental to, of course, the civilians and the people in the nation. And fighting a war leads to people dying, leads to homelessness, lack of health care, lack of money, architecture, history destroyed, all of that. And so there's argument to when a country says that they do not want to go to war, or they don't want to become involved in a war, or they don't want to support any sort of continuation of a war because it's just going to lead to more of these things happening. However, there is also the other argument that if a country wants to go into a war or become involved in a war, that doing so could, say, depose a dictator who is raving chaos upon their citizens. Getting into that war could stop a genocide. It could secure some resources. It could help the nation that wants to go to war. There's always economic benefits to that. And so when you're presented with those two sides of the argument, there's truth in both of them. However, at the end of the day, you do have to make a decision whether that is to go to war or to not be involved. And sometimes it's easy to believe that you want all of it. You would want that dictator to be deposed and the citizens of that country to be helped. However, you don't want to start a war because more people are going to die, this, that, and the other. You're wanting to save the most people. However, in reality, it's just not the case. Sometimes not being involved in a war can lead to more people dying, and of course, being involved in it can save people or lead to more casualties and make things worse. An example of an incursion that did help and say there were arguments on both sides of how it could help and didn't was NATO's 1999 involvement in Yugoslavia. We had ethnic cleansing going on in the nation that the nations involved were not stopping. And so there's the argument that we could go in and we could stop that. And of course, there's the argument of we could not go in. We could hope that they could solve it diplomatically. We could hope that they could just stop and, realize their badness or whatever. But we made the decision to go in and solve what ended up becoming I would say, a better outcome of that dictator being deposed and the ethnic cleansing stopping. Yes, there is the truth that the war caused casualties. It caused destruction of property, destruction of history. All that does happen because that is war. However, the side that would argue that going into the war would stop the dictator and stop the ethnic cleansing was right. And that's because it had a little more truth. It had some truth to it, just as the other side did. But instead of just saying, we're not going to do anything at all because we want it all, that didn't happen. We had a choice that was made, and we came up with I would say, a better outcome to not doing anything.
Yeah, and that's why, like, I'm about to blow your mind, Jad. Like, it's been a long time since you heard this quote, so I just want to remind you. Like, remember Charlottesville, and Trump was being asked about
2017, yes.
everything. He said, "Yeah, exactly. There are good guys on both sides." So
Man, that brings me back.
it really does bring it back, you know. I mean, it's
Oof.
like, and of course, war, it's a really big thing. A lot of people die, a lot of things get destroyed, homes get destroyed, people are left homeless. A lot of bad things happen in war. That's just what war is.
It's the truth of it.
Um, but yeah, exactly, it's the truth of it. But you can't let that stop you from making a decision. That can't be the only reason why you don't intervene if you are a neutral state looking at two warring parties. Um, you have to judge, who is on the truth first of all. Like you hear arguments on both sides, and you can't just walk away saying there are good guys on both sides. You have to come to a conclusion and say like who is more good? What argument makes the most sense? And
What
that's
argument
why,
has the most truth in it?
yeah, like humans should be able to determine truth. There are always going to be arguments on both sides. But looking at both sides and not doing anything, it's like the actions of a robot, you know? It's the thing that separates us from robots in a case like that, determining truth, is to distinguish the two, to to be able to measure and line up truth with counter arguments rather than standing alone. And that's just the fact of it. So in the case of neutrality, there's always a question of like by by intervening, are we saving more lives than would have been killed, like than would have ended, would have been lost? And that's always a hard question because if you're the head of state or an intellectual or just a civilian, like looking at it all, you are you are kind of dealing against fate. You're wondering, okay, by intervening, are we somehow going to stop something that might happen? How do we know that that's going to happen? you know I mean, it looked very likely, to anyone like looking at it like truthfully back in the 30s in America, France, Britain, that there was going to be a genocide in Central Europe, but there wasn't a certainty, and the people back then were just damn oblivious. So like it's really hard to tell if you're a head of state now today and you're looking at, for example, Russia v Ukraine. By intervening, are you saving more lives, or are you causing a nuclear holocaust that'll kill tens of millions of people? That's the really hard question that people like Biden, Macron, Schultz, Johnson, like that's what all of them are thinking right now.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
Ukraine is a great example of looking at doing something or not doing something. Before the war, it was some people were saying that, a war would happen, that Putin would invade, that he would try to take Kyiv and start a whole new puppet state in Eastern Europe. And of course, other people said that this wouldn't happen, that Russia was doing this as a stunt, that this was to get more attention and to try to get more leverage on the world stage. And at the end of the day, we saw that the side of Putin would invade became true. Putin invaded Ukraine on February 24th. That's a fact. That's what happened. And so we had our leaders, we had leaders of nations presented with the question of what were you going to do about it? We have the sides of course, get involved or support different sides. It could be we want to support Ukraine because they feel that Russia's war is leading to the death of civilians. It's leading to violence, uh, disposition of refugees, destruction of history, all that kind of stuff. Or you had the argument of, which also came to the question of at other nations, should you support Russia? Do you support that they have some historical claims to the land, that Ukraine's government is not legitimate, that their war with the Donbass had led to more civilians, and so that the Russians were justified in doing that? Or in both of these arguments, again, have levels of truth to them. However, some have more than the others. Like the idea of Russia having historical claims at Ukraine while having a little bit of merit. It is not as true as sometimes it is presented. But you had those, we could go on about that, we probably will. But you had the two, you have two ideas of, we could support Ukraine, you could support Russia, and of course there's always the third option of don't do anything. You could say that supporting the war is going to continue the war and lead to more people dying and just more violence, and violence is bad, so we don't want that. And so you have that idea of just don't do anything. Hopefully the two sides will figure it out. And so what you get with that is you have countries like initially Germany was, in which they would not give a firm stance of whether they would provide aid towards Ukraine, or if they would cut off Russia's oil supplies to the nation, or any kind of sanctions of that sort. You had the epitome of not choosing either of the sides and basically not really doing much in that initial part of the war. When you do that, all you're doing is letting whatever happens happen. It's just going to continue. The war is not just going to magically stop because you want both sides to figure it out and hope that they come to some conclusion. When you do nothing, it just continues, and now you have no influence over it. And at the end of the day, you can't even say you were there to help it. You just stood on one side. You said that both sides had some truth and just kind of left it at there.
Because indecision is fine, like on a micro level. Like if you don't know what clothes you're gonna wear one day, you know, or if like you're alone at home and you're choosing between two outfits, and you're like, why don't I just wear neither one of them and keep wearing the clothes that I'm wearing, for a second, third, or fourth day during quarantine for a lot of people. Or I won't even wear clothes at all, so that on a micro level does not matter. But on a macro level, it does. Because then like there's the potential that more people would have been killed. Like that's why it's such a head banging, like knock your head against a wall sort of thing for many European and even American governments back when we look back at the 30s and 40s, is that if we just put a little bit more pressure on Germany back then, like if oil supplies would have just simply ceased to be sent over to Nazi Germany until they rolled back their anti-Semitic policies and their other genocidal policies, then a lot of what did happen probably wouldn't have happened.
It could have helped.
So, yeah, it could have helped. Like the amount of people that were killed in our timeline probably would not have been killed, and like if that were to have happened, if those governments were to have made such action. But we don't know, and that's why again it's so hard for people today, for heads of state today, because they're always wondering, are we doing the right thing? Are what we are is what we were doing is what we're doing today going to save lives? By not going into the war, are we saving lives? By not giving those fighter planes that Poland promised back in March, are they going to save lives? By cutting oil supplies, like by doing a complete embargo on Russian oil, is that going to save lives? So, or are you just going to put millions of Russian people into homelessness? That's the question. So like which action is saving the more lives here?
Hmm.
So, um,
Yeah, and it's you had to admit it's a very difficult question because you're not going to get the answer of this one will save everyone's life and there will be no consequences. That just doesn't exist. It's mythical thinking. It's mythical thinking to think that you'll get the very, very best outcome where just everything's perfect. You'll never get that. And so you'll have two or three or six or 18 different ideas which have varying levels of what it could help and what it couldn't, what it could, how many people it could save, or how much it could inflame tensions, or how much it could make the war worse. But at the end of the day, when you do nothing, you have no control over it. You have no influence. There's nothing stopping those two countries from doing what they were already doing. Say if Germany would never get involved in Ukraine, the war can continue, Russia could press the advantage and maybe get pushed back and maybe end up trading some nuclear blows at each other. But nothing there was no influence, there was no help, there was no choice made by a country like Germany to do anything. And so when that happened, that idea of not being involved to save the most lives, which was a wishful thinking to the start, it could be disproved as as false and leading to something much much worse than what could have happened if you'd made the choice to get involved one side or the other.
right. And, just to throw additional examples, like the idea that you can't stand aside in a time of war or other like emergency. Um, Before I get to that, I just want to say like what Western governments are doing right now, including like others, like Australia and even Japan, by making Putin worried about the Kuril Islands. Um, that that is all doing its job. Like everyone is doing to a certain extent their job. It's hard to say for now which one is the right decision, which is really the topic of discussion for this whole thing. Like, what is the right choice? But I'd say that it is a lot better, than standing aside, which again is the whole like point we're making here. So World War One, there's a lot of hate towards America for not getting into the war earlier. And back in America, during the time, like Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, he got reelected off of the point that he made to the American public that he kept us from the war. Um, but by early 1917, that changed. We got back into the war in America. Um, and it changed the landscape. The Western powers were under threat of actually being pushed into the sea by Germany. There was a threat. That Ludendorff and Hindenburg and the Kaiser, the leaders of Germany at the time, would succeed in their goals. Um, but the introduction of like the bringing in of hundreds of thousands, and eventually millions of American soldiers on the Western Front changed it. And in the last few weeks, they broke the German lines and had them running back, not back to Berlin, not back to the Rhine, but far enough to the point in where they just had to sue for peace, enough to cause revolution in the country because of the conditions of the war. So I'm sure, Chad, you can mention this too, but like there's a very strong feeling now, and of course back then, that if America were to have gotten into the war earlier, then a lot of the things that did happen would not have happened.
Exactly. If the United States had gotten into the war, say some of the most violent offenses of World War One, like the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Verdun, may not have happened because the additional support of American troops could have reinforced them. Millions of people wouldn't have died in such fruitless battles, and the war could have ended 2, 3, 4 years earlier.
We
But
could have gotten out of the trenches.
yeah, it could have been ended. It could have been solved had the US been involved earlier. But since the choice was made to not do anything, that just leaves the war to just run its course. We didn't have really any influence on, say, how the battles were going. We weren't fighting them. We could keep providing aid, we could keep morally supporting them, but we had no influence. We had no way to ensure that whatever side we supported would have the right outcome because we just stepped aside and did nothing. And as we saw, once the United States joined the war kind of wrapped up pretty quickly. And so we could see that if we had joined the war, it would have led to a much different outcome just how quickly it kind of gotten. Had that happened in 1915, 1916, it could have ended up way different. But at the end of the day, we don't know because the choice wasn't made. And when we get these kind of choices, when leaders get these choices now, with say Ukraine or Afghanistan or Syria, it's hard to know what is the right choice. It's difficult because you don't always have all of the information. And we're not future tellers. We can't see exactly what's going to happen once you make that decision. You just got what you have now. And it's usually up to history to decide whether or not it was a right decision. In the in World War One, we saw that it may not have been the right decision for the U.S. to stay out of World War One, but at the time it was hard to know. But we saw that that lack of choice led to, I guess, what could have been an optimal situation being missed. But it's hard to know that, and of course, it's hard to know that, and you can't. I would argue that you can't let that stop you from making a decision. Yes, there's the two sides and you have to weigh them according to do that. But you have to do something because there's going to be a little more merit to one side than the other. And at the very least, there's something that you or your nation that you're representing or your cause or liberal democracy, whatever it be, there's something that you do support that you could find in one of those sides and do something with it. And I see that as that's usually what needs to be done is some sort of action needs to be taken as a lot of times when you look, inaction can be so much worse than making a decision and it being, say, wrong.
Right. And just to, really hammer home that point, like America was sending aid, over to the West, the Western allies, including Russia, or at least attempting to, back as early as 1915, and definitely by 1916. Um, but it was proven, that that wasn't enough. Like we can all look at the battle maps and try to imagine, like, hey, like, would the war have ended sooner? And I think it would have, honestly. I think Chad agrees too, the war would have ended sooner. Not many people know about World War One. Not many people know about the atrocities that happened during World War One. The Armenian genocide, the rape of Belgium, the sending of Belgian and French citizens over to Germany to, conduct forced labor in Germany for, I believe, was no pay. Um, that those were things, atrocities on the Eastern Front, because there's always atrocities on the Eastern Front. Um, yeah, but yeah, I mean, there were atrocities that happened during World War One, in a war that people know about, largely with trenches, but there was a lot more to that. There was a lot more that people don't know. Terrible things happened in World War One, and those things probably would not have happened if America got into the war. Because before America, declared war and started sending troops, Russia was on the side, and there was a two-front war Germany was fighting. They were fighting England and France on one side in the west. They were fighting Russia in the east. They had to split their forces, and they were able to beat Russia, by the end of 1917, before America had already brought in a lot of its troops, because they didn't bring a lot of their troops into France until early to mid 1918. And so it was after they beat Russia that they turned and brought back 1 million troops over to the West to nearly beat the West. It was only until American troops, which just then started coming in, that they were able to win the war, the West. But I'm sure if you can imagine, if there were 1 million troops that were to be sent to the West once they defeated Russia, that were still fighting against Russia, in this alternate scenario by, let's say, 1915, and America was finally bringing in its troops, then they would have been able to tip the balance. And the war might have been won earlier. 3 years of trench fighting may not have happened. So anyway, the um, the idea that we're continuously hammering home about how many lives are being saved and which decision saves the most lives. Well, we kind of have to ask the question, like, leaders that don't take this into account, saving the most lives, they don't care about saving the most lives. They just want to save their own people's lives to care for the next election, maybe for life itself, but only within their country. You know, like, what is their goal? Are they just trying to save the people within their own country, or are they saying that they're acting against life itself?
Hmm.
They're acting on the side of life itself. So that's the real question.
Yeah. You could say, are they trying to seek what could be the best outcome in whatever that war or crisis is, or are they just trying to save their reelection? Are they just trying to keep themselves out of it? Or are they trying to seek the mythical proposition that you could save the most lives by not hoping that it doesn't happen? And you do got to ask the question of what are you hoping to do by not doing anything? And sometimes you might not get an answer that you like, sometimes you can. And this goes to the idea that making a decision lots of times is the best outcome. However, it is not always the right outcome if, that decision is the wrong one. When you make a decision, of course, you could be right or wrong, and you're going to make mistakes, and of course, you got to learn from that kind of thing. And when it's on the grander stage, it could be a very big failure. And what you would hope in those kind of situations is that you step back and you hope to make the right decision. But that all comes back to the question of, you made a decision. You could still keep making decisions, but just making one and then leaving it and not doing anything about it could lead to just even more hardship that, say, that first failed decision can do. And one example I see of that is the United States war with Vietnam. We could see in retrospect that it might not have been a good decision to invade Vietnam. It ended up leading to millions of people dying, millions of displacements, and at the end of the day, the United States goals were not really met. We saw that the North continued and captured the South and reunited it under the communist regime. And so you could say that it was not the right decision. And during the course of the war, people were coming to the conclusion that, hey, this involvement that we're having might not be the right choice. And we saw how, like, the Pentagon Papers were released. We saw protests, some of the largest protests in our nation's history against the war. And there's the option, of course, to just keep going with that decision, to not really change that decision at all, to just, okay, the United States will keep fighting the war and hope that they could win it, when the fact of the matter is that it was the wrong decision. Even at the time, they could see it. And so they could have continued it. More people would be dying, more people would be suffering, and you'd just be living with the bad decision because, A, you want to double down on it. But as we saw what happened, the better decision was, well, a decision was made to leave, to stop the United States involvement in the war in Vietnam, to pull the troops out, in the hope that it would help us as a nation to stop being involved with this and hopefully stop the conflict, which at the end of the day, it didn't, but it led to a reunified country which is bettering itself now and is at a way better place than it would have been should this war have just kept on going and going and going for 20 or so years as we had, say, Afghanistan. But a decision was made, a course change was made. Even when that first decision was made, they didn't, you, while we did kind of stay with it for a little bit, we changed it. You made a better one. We looked at the side of the truth and saw that maybe this was the better option. And so when you make that first decision, you could change that, but you're still making a decision. You're not just sitting with it and hoping for the better, but you're still making a choice. And that new choice could be even better than the first one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really just to round it all up, because we're getting pretty close to the hour mark. That's largely what we wanted to talk about today. We wanted to talk about the just bringing home the argument about the kernels of truth with those examples and neutrality. Um, it's just, looking at today's situation in Ukraine, the war over there, we um, we can't know, if the leaders of majority Western countries are doing the right thing by doing what they're doing. It's definitely more than just doing nothing. But is it enough? Is it enough to just send aid? Because I bet Wilson thought it wasn't enough. I bet Wilson thought it was enough to send aid back in 1915, 1916. But it's proven later on now that the war could have been ended sooner by acting sooner in a military conflict. So even now, with the threat of nukes, which complicates the issue so much, we have to again ask the question, are we doing enough? And we can't know until later. So Biden, Macron, Schultz, Erdogan, Johnson, they're all left to ask those questions now. And we don't know. We'll have to see.
Yep. They have to
I
make the decisions that they have to with the resources we have, with which sides have the most truth, which sides seem the most correct, and so what side are we going to do? And they're going
right.
to make those choices.
It's clear that one side is on the side of truth more. It's
Yep.
clear that Zelensky is more on the side of truth. Um, is it enough?
That's the next question. Is your choice enough? Was it the right one? And as we saw with Vietnam, you can learn that while it's happening, or sometimes it might take decades for you to figure out whether it was the right choice. But when you have the chance and you can realize whether or not it's enough, then what are you going to do about that? Are you going to do more? Are you going to do less? Are the decisions that you're doing, is that going to be it, or are you going to change it? And so it's not over when you make that first one. It's what are you going to do going forward as things change, as things adjust, as history plays its course.
Yeah. So after all that, we just really wanted to be thorough when making those arguments by coming up with a bunch of different examples, throwing all our evidence at it, so you guys could really get to what we're saying. Um, but um, but yeah, I mean, this should be the end of our series on truth. But if we come up with another thing that we want to add that should be part of this series, um, then we'll post. You can expect to, for us to continue posting every 2 to 3 days. Um, but from now on, or at least until the further notice, this will be the end of our series on truth. Um, Next thing you can probably expect is going to be a few special episodes. Chad and I had a few ideas of things we wanted to talk about, um, that will probably be a bit more instructive than what we've already um, been releasing so far.
Yeah.
Just a sneak peek, a couple ideas. What were they, Chad? They were about like whether or not the nuke in 45 was a good option. Was it whether it was the better option? What was another one?
Um, I have to recall, but that's one of the biggest ones we had. Another one is looking at the philosophical, the trolley problem, in which you turn the lever, one person dies, you turn the lever, five people die. Looking at that question, and we have a lot more, and I think you're going to really like the ones that we come up with. So, of course, you got to stay tuned for those.
All right. So, a quick outro. You know what to do. Like, subscribe, all that. Maybe comment to see how we did, so we can improve. We're still very new with this whole like YouTube channel thing. So, without a further ado, we are the Marshals of Truth. We'll see you a couple days from now.